Hello class, today we're going to look at the period known as Reconstruction, which is the period right after the Civil War, basically putting Humpty Dumpty back together again. After Abraham Lincoln's assassination, his vice president, Andrew Johnson, becomes president. He's from Tennessee, he's from the South, but he stayed in the Union. And he's quoted as saying, "I voted against Lincoln, I spoke against him, I spent my money to defeat him, but I still love my country." And so Lincoln thought in order to try to keep the South in the Union, he would put a Southerner as his vice president. And when the Civil War is over, I mean, the country's looking at all kinds of issues. I mean, we suddenly have 4 million freed people. What is going to happen to them? Like, how do we place them in society? What kind of rights are we guaranteeing? We said they're not slaves, but are they citizens? And what kind of citizens are they? And then, the South has been destroyed and needs to be rebuilt. And how do we put the South back into the Union? Are we even going to punish anybody for what is going on? And are we going to have to take a good look at the power shared or controlled, or who would be in primacy, the federal government, the state government? And so, this was supposed to be, in the eyes of the Union and in the eyes of Abraham Lincoln, a birth of freedom, like finally making the Declaration of Independence live up to what its creed. And like I said, the South is completely destroyed. I mean, there's just so many factors into what are we going to do now that the war is over? So, we have, a large toll. We're not just talking about 65,000 dead. We're talking about people that come back maimed and hurt, and you have to deal with that. How do we reestablish everything? How do we rebuild everything? And like I said, this period is known as as the period of Reconstruction. We have a large group of freed men, slaves, who now are part of the nation's economy in a way that they had never been before. And in a sense, that capital that plantation owners had built up on the backs of slaves, about $3 billion has now disappeared because they freed their slaves. And then there was a lot of competition for jobs because suddenly, poor white people had to now compete with African Americans for jobs. And not to mention the infrastructure, over 9,000 miles of rail had been destroyed in the South. And Lincoln tried his best to deliver a message to the country, not to the North, not to the South, but to the country. And in the second inaugural address, he says, "With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right. Let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among others and with all nations." And here he is trying to address the nation, explaining to them, we have a lot of work ahead, but we need to do it not without malice. We need to do it with charity. We need to help, welcome them back in the country, but a very new and different country. Now, Lincoln's assassinated before he gets to implement any plans, but we do know what he was planning. He had what was known as a 10% plan, which meant that 10% of the people who could vote in 1860 had to swear allegiance back to the Union in order for any state to become a state. States had to create a whole new government, and it had to be approved by the federal government. It also had to obey the emancipation laws, the freeing the slaves. They had to abide by those things in order to be allowed back into the Union. This was Lincoln's plan, not carried out, but this is what he was already trying to put together. And, Republicans didn't like this. They wanted more firmness in the South. They wanted punishment in the South. So they introduced the Wade Davis bill. And this says that 50% of the people who could vote in 1860 had to swear allegiance. And that once again, they had to have a new government approved by the federal government, and it couldn't have anybody who served or aided in the Confederacy. And once again, they had to obey the emancipation laws. Now, and Republicans subscribe to this idea that, state suicide theory, meaning that they ceased to be a state when they seceded, and therefore they had to go and be readmitted in whatever way the federal government deemed them to be readmitted. Lincoln didn't like the Wade Davis bill, and it was vetoed. And people started leaning toward the 10% idea that Lincoln had. And so this becomes like the fight in Congress of what's going to happen. And when Lincoln died, the person to take it up as far as the executive branch is Johnson. Now, Johnson liked Lincoln's plan. He is a Southerner. There were a group in Congress known as the Radical Republicans that wanted punishment for the South, harsher treatment to the South, and he was against this. And it would be the fight between him and Congress that would define the period known as Reconstruction. Now, when it comes to what he is thinking, what he is looking at, what he is advocating for is, first of all, pardoning all ex-Confederates. All rebels had to sign an oath of allegiance. 10% had to, sign the oath to be readmitted. And he would include that some high-ranking Confederate officials could be included, but as long as their worth wasn't more than $20,000, meaning if they weren't the super wealthy ones. They had to make a new constitution in which they had to, ratify the 13th Amendment and reject the idea of secession ever again, reject the idea of states' rights ever again, and submit to the will of the U.S. government. And so what they were trying to do is shift the way the South was from this aristocracy run by the upper class to like this middle lower class control of whites. Now, the 13th Amendment is, the Emancipation Proclamation only freed the slaves in the South. So what we needed was a law of the land that would end slavery. And this became the 13th Amendment, which said, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude except as a punishment for a crime, which is, an argument made to this day that we still have a form of slavery, where the party shall have been duly convicted shall exist within the United States or in any, place subject to a jurisdiction, and Congress shall have the power to enforce this law through popular legislation, meaning, slavery would no longer exist except in the form of punishment, and Congress could pass any other law to support this amendment. Now, when we look at, what Johnson is proposing, there's a lot of things that are still left as questionable. And, one thing is it makes no mention of free education or education at all for freedmen. It made no mention of citizenship, voting rights. A lot of the radical Republicans saw this as like, no, you're kind of keeping them, we're saying they're free, but not really free. They don't have all the rights and privileges, and this is not what we're looking to find. And in the South immediately starts to trying to find a way to control these newly freed African Americans. And then you also see the emergence of the KKK to maintain racial order in the South. And black codes were, were all kinds of laws that were basically, in a sense, the re-enslavement of African Americans. They had to follow curfews. There was vagrancy laws, like if you were just like walking around town, during the day and you couldn't, prove that you were working or you had a job with somebody, you could be jailed for vagrancy. And then once they got you in jail, they could go ahead and rent you out as slave labor. So just basically re-enslave you. Everyone had to have a job somewhere in order to move around. You had to prove that you were working for somebody somewhere. And it was the same kind of passes that you'd have to carry around that slaves had to carry around. And then when they knew that they could not get them to, work the farms like they used to as slaves, the new system was introduced, which was called sharecropping. And in sharecropping was basically slavery all over again. Basically, these families were given tracts of land in what would have been the big plantation. And each one, had to farm that land, cotton or whatever was being grown there. And they paid their rent in what they produced on the farm. So basically, the plantation owners still got their land worked by semi-slaves. And these people were tied to the land and could never really own it. And it was just a whole new idea of how to keep slavery going. And then, of course, African Americans couldn't vote, serve on jury, have any kind of real marital rights. There was all kinds of stuff that, they weren't allowed to do. So what really were they? They weren't slaves, but they apparently weren't even citizens. And some of these black codes, just to give you an example of them, and this is a congressman's reaction to a black code, like the set of black codes that were being established. It was like, Blacks eat, sleep, move, live only by the tolerance of whites who hate them. Basically, their land, their bodies, their existence is still governed by white people, by white bosses, maybe not called owner, but they're still, in the same sense, under the same thumb of the same groups of people. You know, and when we look at some of the quotes by some politicians, here's Mississippi Governor 1866. Whether we like it or not, we must realize the fact now and forever to be free. However, it does not make him a citizen or entitle him to social or political equality with the white man, meaning he's free, but he ain't like us. And this leads to all kinds of black codes, like the one in St. Landry's Parish, which basically says that no Negro shall be allowed to pass within the limits of the parish without some sort of permit from their employer. Otherwise, they can be charged a fine of $2.50. And really, you know, these newly freed slaves were poor. These kind of fines were basically a way to put them in jail, and then the jail would rent them out to plantation owners. And so you had slavery all over again. And many of the black codes that were passed were all designed to put them in prison where they could now be sold as slaves all over again. So like if you're not at home by a certain time and you're out and about and you don't have permission for your employer, you can be charged $5, which you didn't have, and you would go to prison and be rented out as a slave. And that's what all the purpose of all these things that, you know, if, you know, they were just trying to find new and different ways to put people into jail, because that, remember, that was the exception in the 13th Amendment, unless they are jailed and convicted of a crime. So they came up with all kinds of crimes, you know, so that they could charge them, you know, something where they could put them in jail and then you know, rent them out as slaves. So that's what all these black codes were about. You know, and you know, you had like what would eventually become sundown towns, where you couldn't be out on the streets when the sun went down. Otherwise, you were considered to be a vagrant or something, and you would be thrown in jail. And no way in heck would you ever be allowed to carry any kind of weapon or firearm. You know, once again, you could be fined money that you didn't have, and you would be put to work. So, and what all these things are meant to do, like I said, is just re-enslave African Americans. These black codes later will be called Jim Crow laws, and sometimes they're not even on the books, but they're just maintain the racial hierarchy. So you had like two groups of people fighting it out as radical Republicans, and what they're looking to do is, what are we going to do with this, you know, with this new group of people? How are we going to allow them to become the citizens that we want them to be? And radical Republicans are the ones that are pushing for economic equality. They're pushing for the right to vote. They're pushing for, you know, the freedom that they thought they were going to get when the 13th Amendment was passed. And so, you know, these are the types of bills that are being sent to Johnson's desk to be signed. And Johnson continuously, over and over, vetoes all these bills that the radical Republicans put forth. And so, you know, they were looking to block any kind of Southerners from entering Congress. They were trying to get the free population some representation, but then they quickly realized that if they kind of did make all African Americans free, but then the South controlled their vote by intimidation, they were in a sense giving the South a lot more power. They were giving them a bigger population to be counted, no more 3/5. Now all the slaves are being counted as though they were citizens, but they're still not citizens, and their voting privileges are controlled by white people. So in a sense, we're giving more power to the South, and this is kind of the roots of the way they would later connect it to the Electoral College to give the South more votes. So, you know, as the Civil Rights Act of 1866 is passed, the creation of Freedmen Bureau, all these things are being vetoed over and over again by Johnson. Johnson was in the way of all these Reconstruction laws, but there was so much, there were so many in the Congress that supported these bills that every time he vetoed it, they overrode his veto with a 3/4 vote. And so eventually they realized they had to do something, and this is by the 14th and 15th Amendments had to be passed to solidify the rights of these freed people. The 14th Amendment establishes your citizenship, and it also establishes equal protection before the law, meaning all laws apply to everybody the same, and then all rights apply to everybody the same. Anytime later, when you hear about civil rights, court cases go forth, they're all 14th Amendment rights and claims. And excuse me. And so what the 14th Amendment goes on to do is it's supposed to allow for African Americans to use this as a tool to get more rights and to be protected and have all the rights and privileges that everybody have. That was the idea behind it. But then, the South reclaimed the South. And one thing that there was some opposition to the 14th Amendment, and it was really interesting. Women were opposed to the 14th Amendment only because it only mentioned men. And they were like, if you're giving the right to vote, give it to everybody. Not just, males. You're not just giving citizenship to males. You should give citizenship to everyone. And when the 15th Amendment comes around, that gives them the right to vote, once again, they try to oppose it, not because they don't want the 14th Amendment and 15th Amendment to be passed, but they're trying to get women in there as well. It's like, as long as you're defining citizenship, as long as you're defining right to vote, why not give women the same rights? Now, President Johnson goes on to be the first president to be impeached. And he's impeached because he violates the Tenure in Office Act, which I'll talk about in a second. But a lot of people may or may not understand impeachment. We just went through one. But the way it works is basically, impeachment's like an indictment process. The first step is the House of Representatives hold hearings and they say, yes, there's enough evidence for a trial. Then the second step is the Senate has the trial. And if there's a 2/3 vote of senators, then the president gets removed. We've never made it past the second one. For Johnson, he barely misses being removed by one vote. He is brought up on charges for violating Tenure in Office Act, which meant that he couldn't replace people in the cabinet without consulting Congress. And he replaces Secretary of War. And when he does that, they immediately charge him with the Tenure in Office Act. And like I said, he's impeached the first step, but he doesn't get removed, and only the removal is shy by one vote. But he's the first president to get impeached. And a lot of the idea behind impeachment is, in the end, the president is not above the law. He's a common citizen and can be tried and convicted. Now, with Johnson kind of out of the way, they kind of silence him at that point. They start to move forward with their plan for Reconstruction. Their plan to put Humpty Dumpty back together again, and their plan to try to guarantee rights to African Americans. So this is kind of what it plays itself out as, is oath of allegiance. 50% have to have a vote of allegiance. No high-ranking Confederate officers anywhere. If you don't sign the oath, you don't get the right to vote. And every state had to ratify the Reconstruction Amendments. 13th Amendment, freeing the slaves. 14th Amendment, establishing citizenship and equal protection both on the law. And 15th Amendment, the right to vote for males. They had to reject secession, the right to secession. They had to reject the state rights theory, and they had to submit to government authority. These are the acts that finally get passed to put the country back together again. They create freedmen bureaus throughout the states to help deal with the newly freed African-American population. They divided the South into 5 military districts, and they were occupied by the Union Army to make sure that all these things were done and the rights and the privileges of African-Americans were respected. And like I said, the 15th Amendment, a right to vote to all males, because only males were recognized as citizens at the time. And what's really fascinating and I guess sad at the same time is that time period when the Union Army is occupying the South. And those amendments are passed. It is, to steal a phrase from an old musical Camelot, one brief shining moment, things were as they should have been for African Americans. They got to own land. They got to hold office. They were elected to Congress. They were elected mayors. And, it was a South, like what the South could be if we just took away all these restrictions. And they, as long as they had the protection of the federal army, the South was finally, black people in the South were finally free. And, it's a very different looking South, but it does not last too long. And one thing the Freedmen's Bureau, immediately starts to do is create an educational system for freedmen and their children. And they built thousands of schools to, educate blacks. Because remember, before this, it was illegal to teach them to read or write. So suddenly you have this whole millions of people free, but they don't have the tools to navigate society. And so one of the main objects of the Freedmen's Bureau is to establish schools and get people educated so that they could be productive members of society. And so this is like one of the proud moments of the Freedmen's Bureau. Finally establishing schools and opening schools for everybody. Now, there was a lot of money in Reconstruction to begin with because the federal government had to put in all kinds of money to rebuild the South, to put in roads, bridges, canals, telegraphs. There was all kinds of people making money off of, Reconstruction, rebuilding the South. So, in a sense, there was like a good reason to promote Reconstruction because it was a good, it was a good business opportunity for a lot of people. And so you see the South get rebuilt. You see, railroad lines. You see hospitals. You see, the economy finally diversifying because up until this, their economy is solely built around cotton production. So even if there was no Civil War or whatever, eventually, you cannot make an economy just on one thing. So this interconnection is connecting people to national markets, diversifies the South's economy and gives it a chance to grow and to survive. And here are the military districts and the dates they were, admitted back into the Union after they had passed all the, all the things that they needed to do with swearing leadership, ratifying the amendments, and then slowly they were allowed to go back into the Union.